So the video for Muster is finally ready, and Muster is all but officially removed from the game. Swing and a miss. Welcome to Pass. I'm hg3, and this is the follow-up discussion to kind of bring out more on the mechanics we discussed in our mechanic series. This week, of course, we talked about Muster, an ability where you pull the same name characters from your deck or your hand to the battlefield. Now, the concept still exists, but the actual term and the form has been shifted a bit. So if you watch the video, you'll notice that it does say from your deck and your hand. Now, for Crohn's, when you read the card, it'll say it pulls from your deck. And when I think about this, I'm not sure if that's a buff or a nerf, because when you think you have two Crones in your hand and one in your deck, now you do have two plays to make. The first one's going to pull from your deck, obviously, so you'll get two Crones out of it. You do have the alternate of throwing the second one out at a different time, so you kind of get to stagger. So maybe a little bit better off, but at the same time, you can't get that big power play if you wanted the surge in like one turn. If you had a blocker for Scorch and a blocker for Epidemic ready, and you thought that was the opportunity, then you're not going to be able to get that value out of it. But I mean, it might end up being a buff. So we'll have to think of it a little more. But, you know, the one thing I liked about Muster, and it still is in the game in that new form where it's going to pull cards from your deck, but it is no longer a core feature of every faction. It's in fact limited to mostly monsters. It's involved in some capacity with, I believe, Northern Realms, who have a special which basically triggers muster on one of your bronze cards. But now that it's just a monster ability, it's going to make the dynamic in monster deck building very interesting. Since it's only 4 or 5 cards mainly that are going to be using it, you'll have to select maybe 1 or 2 sets out of those. Otherwise, like I mentioned in the mechanics video, you're going to have too much going on in your deck and your mulligan's going to get a little messy. Even considering the fact that you might get better value out of having two plays if you have 2 out of 3 of a muster set in your hand, you still are losing out in the fact that you don't have an additional ability on whatever muster card you're using for the second play. It's just going to be a flat X damage in case of Crohn's, and some of the other muster cards might have an additional ability, but it certainly isn't going to exceed value over a replacement card if you're deck building properly. Just something to consider. Also, if you're new to Gwent and you're watching these videos, something I'd like to mention, kind of shout out to CD Projekt Red, is that I really enjoy the fact that they have abilities like Muster, the artist formerly known as Muster, who knows what we're going to call it now, and like we'll get to see Promote in a future video, and we see it with Scorch and we see it with Epidemic. These are abilities and their specials that have consequences. It's not just all good in the hood, you know? If you have to make a decision and there's a negative aspect to it. So when it comes down to muster, it could be including too many in your deck. It could be, mulliganing improperly, and all of a sudden you're losing value on it, and you can be punished tremendously by your opponent if they're paying attention. When it comes to Scorch, like it's not just an easy removal. You have to pay attention to what you're doing, otherwise you're going to hurt yourself. You have to plan ahead your moves so that you know when it's going to be appropriate to use your removal. Promote. You can easily be punished if your character gets nerfed before he's promoted, or even when he is promoted, you don't have access to being able to buff him any longer. That could be the downfall of a round. So the dynamic right now in Gwent is really interesting because it's going to allow for clever players to have a lot of wiggle room, and players that just want to uh, see the game as black and white. They just want like a basic formula. Uh, they're going to have a little bit of difficulty. It seems like the Gwent format is going to reward creativity, and that's very encouraging for people that obviously like that kind of dynamic, which could also foster more replayability. even though card games typically have high replayability to start with, I think that this will push it even further because, not only are your factions and your matchups going to be an interesting change in dynamic, but the type of player you're playing. Like, there's going to be high bluff players that are just not even caring about certain rounds depending on their style. There's going to be players that are as direct as you get. And I think that dynamic's going to be interesting. As an aside, basically, uh, from what I thought when discussing muster and making that video. Now that muster is mainly an ability for monsters, it seems like it's going to be an ability on cards that you want to kind of have the stage set for them. Like, Crohn's is a heavy investment. Crohn's, of course, if you watch the video, you see Crohn's had 8 strength. That got changed to. If you go to Gwent DB, all the cards are updated now, according to them, for the closed beta release, which is fantastic. Gwent DB is probably the top resource if you just want info. I would recommend highly just scrolling through there, like on a regular basis, checking out what cards are in their system because that's going to be what you want to familiarize yourself with before you get into the game. But back to Crohn's. Crohn's are a silver card, and obviously, if you don't know, your silver and gold spots are limited in your deck. So the fact that Crohn's are silver and you have to play the set if you're going to include them means that 3 of your silver spots are occupied. So it does create a really interesting dynamic of whether or not it's going to be worth it. And honestly, I'd love to sit here and tell you, yes, Crohn's are still definitively worth it, or no, they're not worth it, don't bother. But I don't think you're going to be able to tell without playing and seeing how much you can leverage them in a second or a third round. Like, if you're certain your opponent is out of removal, then Crohn's in a second or a third round, especially a third round, coming onto the field from one card played from your hand, that's 18 strength that is so easy to buff into 36. And that would be so hard to deal with for many factions. The only faction that can deal with it pretty easily would probably be Scoia'tael. But Scoia'tael might struggle in the first 2 rounds to manage monsters since the volume of troops is going to vary so drastically. Scoia'tael, we haven't really gotten to talk about them yet, but they're going to feature many specials and many mechanics that allow them to get additional uses out of their specials. So, I mean, when I envision that capacity for the Crones, I have to assume that they'd be very powerful, kind of like a cleanup crew, kind of like if you're into sports, like, you've seen that quarterback or what have you in garbage time just cleaning up. And that's kind of what I'm thinking of Crohn's right now, towards the end of the game. Like, they are just there to absolutely bury somebody. And I do like the card. 18 strength is a lot, but you get into this kind of comparison mode where 18 strength out of 3 cards, 3 silvers. Well, how much is that worth? Because you can get 15, 16 strength out of 1 gold card. So do you want to be sacrificing that many slots? But silver cards are buffable, gold cards aren't buffable. So there really is a lot of analysis and playtesting to be done. Obviously, the people that were in the kill list servers, they got their hands on some decks, but those were fixed decks, so they really didn't have any way to experiment outside of what was handed to them. And that does kind of further build up the excitement for when we get into closed beta and we have more access. I'm curious to see what the closed beta access is going to be like, but certainly you'll be able to deck build to some extent, especially now that we've seen the number of cards that are in the system. That's probably a good indication that that will be a main function, and we'll definitely get some action there. So it's unfortunate that Muster is no longer officially in the game, but don't panic. It's still there. They took the term away and they altered it so it doesn't play out of your hand. And like I said before, I think that could end up being for the better. it seemed like playing the second one out of your hands or the third one out of your hand was always going to be a punishment. But still, in the same light, if you have three of a muster card in your opening hand, you're in trouble. So muster management is still a huge thing, and that's going to come into play mostly just for monsters now, unless of course later on they decide to reintegrate it for other factions. It seems like CD Projekt Red is moving towards the direction that like specific abilities will revolve around specific factions now, which was kind of the case and kind of wasn't the case in Gwent in The Witcher. So we'll see how that evolves and how they work with it, or if there'll be some like, bleed over. Like right now, I mentioned that the Northern Realms, I believe, have the special that has the muster ability. Maybe that's how class-specific abilities will manifest themselves in other decks. Like promote might be available through a special. I actually haven't researched that yet. That video will come eventually. So I want to thank everyone that tuned in. Those are my thoughts for now. We will be working on more mechanic videos. If you liked this video, if you liked the previous video on muster, make sure to like it. You can subscribe to the channel. We will have tons of content moving forward, and we are super excited for Gwent. And we hope you share in our excitement, and we hope that this provides some insight for you so that you know how you're going to manage your deck, how you're going to manage your cards when you get into the game. That's really the goal here. You want to get into the game and have some sort of idea about what you're doing and what you're working with so that we can hit it running. Okay, I'm hg3, and I'll see you guys next time.